Scary Bedtime Stories, Zombie Apocalypse, find Katya Gava 2, Mysticism. The Haunting Silence. The sky was an eerie shade of purple as dusk settled over the small town of Gava. It was a ghost town now, once bustling with life, but now abandoned except for the occasional rustling in the shadows. The air hung thick with the scent of decay, a constant reminder of the apocalypse that had unfolded. People had fled, died, or worse turned. Viktor stepped cautiously through the overgrown streets, his heart pounding with every step. His mission was clear: find Katya. She had sent a cryptic message, barely legible, just before the communication lines went dead. It had only 3 words: Gava. Find me. Katya had been his lifeline when everything collapsed. She knew something about the virus, about the strange forces behind the outbreak, that no one else did. And now, with the world in chaos, Viktor had to find her. He gripped his rifle tightly, his knuckles turning white as his eyes scanned every shadow. The town was unnervingly quiet, except for the occasional distant growl, a chilling reminder that the dead still walked. He had encountered a few of them on his way in. Slow, shambling corpses, but lethal if you let your guard down for even a second. The trick was not to make noise, not to draw attention. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows that twisted and curled, playing tricks on his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Every step he took felt heavier, as if the very ground beneath him was holding its breath, waiting for something. His destination was the Gava School, a building that stood at the edge of town. Katya had mentioned it once before in passing, calling it a place of significance. As Viktor approached, the building loomed before him, its windows shattered, and its doors hanging loosely on their hinges. The place looked abandoned, but something about it felt wrong. There was an energy, a pull, as if the school itself was alive. Viktor hesitated at the entrance. His breath came in shallow gasps as he steeled himself to go inside. He had to find Katya. There was no turning back now. The whispering shadows. Inside the school, the air was thick, almost suffocating. The stench of rot and mildew was overpowering, making Viktor's stomach churn. His flashlight flickered as he swept it across the dimly lit hallway. The silence was deafening, broken only by the soft creak of the floorboards beneath his feet. As he ventured deeper into the building, strange whispers began to fill the air. At first, they were faint, like a distant breeze brushing against his ear. But soon, they grew louder, as if the walls themselves were speaking, echoing the voices of the dead. Viktor's heart raced, his mind spinning as he struggled to make sense of it. Katya, he whispered to himself, trying to shake off the fear that gnawed at his insides. The whispers seemed to respond, growing more insistent. He could make out fragments of words, twisted and distorted, like a chorus of tortured souls trapped between worlds. She's close, find her. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the hall, jolting Viktor out of his thoughts. He whipped around, raising his rifle, but saw nothing. His pulse quickened as he moved toward the source of the sound, his senses on high alert. The door to the classroom at the end of the hall stood slightly ajar, a faint light flickering from within. Viktor approached cautiously, pushing the door open with the barrel of his gun. The room was empty, save for a single desk and chair placed oddly in the center. A piece of paper lay on the desk, illuminated by the flickering light from a dying bulb above. Viktor's hands trembled as he picked up the note. The handwriting was familiar, it was Katya's. I'm here, but not how you think. The truth lies beneath. The dead are not what they seem. A cold shiver ran down Viktor's spine. He felt the weight of something sinister pressing down on him. What had Katya meant? Not how he thought. Beneath? Suddenly, the whispers grew louder again, more distinct this time. They weren't just random murmurs anymore. They were calling his name. Viktor could feel his grip on reality slipping as the voices grew more and more insistent. Viktor, Viktor, join us. He spun around, but there was no one there. His flashlight flickered again, and for a split second, he thought he saw shadows shifting at the edges of his vision moving toward him, closer and closer. His breath caught in his throat. You must find her. She is the key, a voice whispered, directly into his ear. Viktor staggered back, his heart pounding in his chest. He had to get out of there. He had to find Katya before it was too late. The unseen threat. Viktor burst out of the classroom, his mind racing. He needed answers, and fast. The cryptic note had only added to the confusion. What did she mean beneath? And why had the voices suddenly seemed to know him? Were they playing tricks on his mind? Or was something far darker at play? As he hurried down the hallway, a sudden, bone-chilling scream echoed through the building, freezing him in place. It was a woman's scream, sharp, terrified, and unmistakably real.
"Katya!"
Viktor yelled, his voice cracking as he sprinted toward the sound. But as he rounded the corner, the scream abruptly stopped. The silence that followed was even more terrifying, as if the very walls were waiting for something terrible to happen. His feet skidded to a halt in front of a large, metal door. It was slightly ajar, and a faint light spilled out from within. His heart thudded in his chest as he pushed it open. The room was a basement, dark, damp, and filled with the unmistakable stench of death. The basement was a labyrinth of shadows, the air thick with moisture and decay. Viktor's breath echoed in the tight space, and every step he took felt like a leap into the unknown. His flashlight barely cut through the oppressive darkness, casting long, eerie shadows on the cracked walls. He descended the stairs slowly, his senses on high alert. There was no sign of the woman who had screamed, but the room felt alive, like the walls were watching, waiting for him to make a mistake. A low growl came from the far corner of the basement.
Viktor froze.
His grip on the rifle tightened as he scanned the room. It wasn't a growl of a human or even an animal. It was something else entirely. Something far more dangerous. His heart pounded in his ears, but he couldn't afford to panic now. With deliberate caution, Viktor moved toward the sound, each step deliberate, his pulse racing. The smell of rot grew stronger as he approached the source of the noise. He could hear faint rustling, something shifting in the darkness. His flashlight flickered again, casting brief glimmers of light on what lay ahead. As the beam settled, he saw it half buried beneath rubble, twitching and shuddering. A figure, but not like the others. The skin was mottled, discolored, decayed. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, but what made Viktor's blood run cold was its face. It wasn't just a mindless corpse, it still had traces of intelligence. Its eyes, clouded but moving, fixed on him. It wasn't just a zombie. It was changing. The creature snarled and tried to rise, its bones cracking as it struggled against the debris.
Viktor's mind raced.
It was unlike anything he had encountered before. The zombies he had fought up until now were predictable, slow-moving shells of the people they once were. But this was different. Something was evolving, something beyond the virus he knew. Without thinking, Viktor raised his rifle and fired. The deafening sound echoed through the basement as the creature collapsed, its body twitching one final time before going still. But something was wrong. The shot should have attracted the others, but the basement remained eerily silent.
Too silent.
Viktor moved closer, kneeling down beside the body. The smell was overwhelming, but he forced himself to study it, searching for any clues. Its chest had been torn open, revealing not just decaying flesh, but something glowing faintly beneath, strange symbols etched into the skin, pulsing with a sickly green light. His hands trembled as he reached for his knife, peeling back the skin to get a closer look. The markings weren't random. They were deliberate, like an ancient script carved into the creature's flesh. Viktor had seen something like this before in the old text Katya had shown him. Symbols of mysticism, forbidden magic. His pulse quickened. This wasn't just a virus. Something far darker was at play. Suddenly, the basement trembled. A deep rumbling sound reverberated through the floor, and Viktor's heart sank. The walls around him began to shift, as if something massive was moving beneath the surface. The very air seemed to vibrate with a low, ominous hum. Then, from the darkness, came a voice. Not a whisper this time, but a low, guttural sound, as if it had crawled out of the depths of the earth. "Katya," it hissed. "She belongs to us." Viktor staggered back, his chest tight with fear. The voice felt like a knife slicing through his mind, cold and sharp. He raised his rifle again, spinning around, but there was nothing there, just shadows closing in on him. Leave this place or be consumed. The voice was everywhere now, echoing off the walls, seeping into his bones. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the rumbling stopped. The basement was silent once more, the air heavy with an unnatural stillness. Viktor's breath came in ragged gasps as he stared at the body before him, the glowing symbols still faintly pulsing. His mind raced. Whatever had caused this, whatever had infected these people, wasn't just biological. It was something ancient, something tied to the very fabric of the town. And Katya was caught in the middle of it. Viktor stood up, his legs shaking beneath him. He had to get out of there, but more than that, he had to find Katya. Whatever this power was, it was hunting her, and it wouldn't stop until it had her. Suddenly, a sound echoed from upstairs, a loud crash, followed by hurried footsteps. Viktor's heart leapt into his throat. Someone or something was coming. He had to move, now. He turned and sprinted toward the stairs, his mind racing. As he reached the top, the school's eerie silence greeted him once more. But this time, something was different. The air felt colder, thicker. The shadows seemed darker, more menacing, as if they were watching his every move.
Viktor paused, listening.
The footsteps had stopped. But he knew he wasn't alone anymore. Into the darkness. Viktor stood frozen at the top of the stairs, his breath caught in his throat. The air in the school was thick with tension, as if the very atmosphere had shifted, becoming heavier with each passing second. He strained to listen, trying to pick up any sound that could hint at who or what was nearby. The silence was deafening, and the oppressive feeling of being watched gnawed at him. The hallway before him seemed to stretch on forever, the shadows twisting and shifting unnervingly. He gripped his rifle tighter, his knuckles turning white as his eyes scanned every inch of the corridor. Somewhere out there, Katya was waiting. He couldn't let the fear paralyze him now. Taking a deep breath, Viktor forced himself to move forward. The sound of his footsteps echoed in the empty school, every creak of the floorboards amplified in the stillness. His flashlight flickered weakly, the beam dancing across the peeling walls and broken lockers. Katya, he whispered under his breath, hoping that somehow she could hear him. The sudden sound of something scraping against the floor made Viktor freeze. His heart pounded in his chest as he turned toward the source of the noise. A door at the far end of the hallway was slowly swinging open, its rusty hinges creaking ominously. Viktor swallowed hard and raised his rifle, inching toward the door. Every instinct screamed at him to turn around, to run, but he pushed the fear aside. He couldn't stop now. The door opened fully, revealing the dimly lit room beyond. He hesitated at the threshold, his flashlight casting a narrow beam into the room. It was a science lab, rows of old, rusted desks lined with forgotten equipment. The room looked like it had been untouched for years, yet something about it felt off. There was an eerie glow emanating from one of the desks, and Viktor's breath caught in his throat as he realized what it was. Another body. The corpse was slumped over the desk, its skin gray and rotting, but just like the one in the basement, strange glowing symbols were etched into its flesh. The green light pulsed slowly, casting sickly shadows across the room. Viktor approached cautiously, his eyes locked on the body. The stench of decay was overpowering, but something about the symbols drew him in. They were similar to the ones he had seen downstairs, but more intricate, more deliberate. Suddenly, the corpse twitched. Viktor jumped back, raising his rifle, but the body didn't move again. His heart raced, and he tried to steady his breathing. He could feel the darkness closing in around him, pressing against his mind. "They're watching you." The voice was back, low and sinister, echoing through the room. Viktor's pulse quickened as the shadows in the corners of the lab seemed to grow darker, deeper. The air felt colder, as if something unseen had entered the room, lurking just beyond his sight. He turned toward the door, ready to leave, but stopped in his tracks. Standing in the doorway was a figure, a woman, her pale skin glowing faintly in the darkness. Her eyes were wide, vacant, and her clothes hung in tattered rags. She took a slow, shuffling step forward, her feet dragging across the floor. "Katya?" Viktor's voice was barely a whisper, filled with disbelief. But the woman didn't respond. She continued her slow, mechanical movements toward him, her head tilted unnaturally to the side. Viktor's heart sank. It wasn't her. It was something else, something wrong. The woman let out a low, guttural growl as she took another step forward, her mouth twisting into a snarl. Viktor stumbled back, his rifle shaking in his hands. He had to act fast. He couldn't let her get close. Suddenly, the woman lunged at him, her hands clawing at the air. Viktor fired, the sound of the gunshot deafening in the small room. The woman's body jerked violently before collapsing to the floor, her vacant eyes staring up at the ceiling. Viktor's breath came in ragged gasps as he stepped over the body, forcing himself to keep moving. He had to find Katya. He had to get out of this cursed place before it swallowed him whole. As he hurried down the hallway, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They weren't just voices, now they were calling his name. Viktor, Viktor, come closer, join us. He could feel the weight of something following him, creeping closer with every step. His flashlight flickered again, and for a brief moment, he caught a glimpse of a shadow moving in the corner of his eye, something large, hulking, and far too close for comfort. The fear surged through him, but Viktor pushed forward, his mind focused on one thing: Katya. He had come too far to give up now. She was the only one who had any answers, the only one who knew what was really happening here. Finally, Viktor reached the end of the hallway. The door before him was marked with a symbol he recognized from Katya's notes, an ancient rune, a ward against dark magic. His heart leaped. This was it. She had to be in there. He grabbed the handle and pushed the door open. Inside, the room was bathed in a strange, otherworldly glow. At the center stood a figure, Katya, her back to him, her hands raised as if she was performing some kind of ritual. Symbols glowed on the walls around her, pulsing in time with her whispered incantations.
Katya,
Viktor called out, his voice hoarse. She turned slowly, her eyes locking onto his. There was something different about her, something cold, detached. Viktor, she said, her voice distant. You shouldn't have come. A chill ran down his spine as he realized that whatever was happening here was far more dangerous than he had imagined. What's going on? What are you doing? Viktor demanded, taking a step forward. Katya lowered her hands, her expression unreadable. I tried to warn you. This place, it's alive. The dead aren't what they seem, and neither am I. Viktor's stomach twisted with dread as her words hung in the air. He had found Katya, but the truth he had been searching for was far more horrifying than he could have ever imagined. The truth unveiled. Viktor stood frozen, his mind grappling with Katya's cryptic words. Her voice, once familiar and warm, now carried a cold, detached edge that sent a chill down his spine. The room, bathed in the eerie glow of ancient symbols, seemed to pulse in time with her words, as if it, too, was alive, an extension of the dark forces at play. You need to explain, Katya, Viktor demanded, his voice steadier than he felt. His eyes scanned the glowing symbols etched into the walls, his thoughts racing. What is this place? What have you done? Katya's eyes flickered with a strange light as she gazed at him, her expression unreadable. For a moment, she seemed to hesitate, as if caught between two worlds, one familiar, one unfathomable. Then, she sighed, her shoulders sagging slightly under the weight of the truth she was about to reveal. This town, Viktor, she began, her voice barely a whisper, it's cursed. Not by something natural, not even by the virus we thought we were fighting.
It goes much deeper than that.
There's an ancient power here, something that was awakened long before we arrived. The dead, they're part of it. They're its messengers, its soldiers. Viktor's heart pounded in his chest as he listened, his mind trying to process her words. He had suspected something far more sinister than a simple outbreak, but this was beyond anything he had imagined. Katya took a step closer, her eyes gleaming with an intensity that both terrified and fascinated him. The symbols you've seen, the ones carved into the flesh of the infected, they're part of a ritual. A binding spell, meant to control the dead, to manipulate them. But it's gone wrong. The power is growing out of control.
And now it wants me.
Viktor's stomach twisted with dread. What do you mean it wants you? Katya hesitated again, her face a mask of turmoil. I was part of the research team that discovered the virus, yes. But I was also studying something else. The ancient texts, the rituals, the mysticism that surrounded this place. I thought I could control it, that I could use it to stop the spread of the virus. But the power, it's too strong. And now, it's feeding on the dead, using them to grow stronger. And it's coming for me because I was the one who awakened it. Her words hit Viktor like a hammer. He had come all this way, fought through hordes of the undead, all to find out that the woman he had been searching for was not only in danger, she was the key to the darkness that had engulfed the town. You awakened it? Viktor's voice was a mix of disbelief and anger. You brought this upon us? I didn't mean to. Katya's voice cracked, and for the first time, Viktor saw the fear in her eyes, the fear of someone who had ventured too far into the unknown and was now paying the price. I thought I could stop it. But I didn't understand the full extent of the power until it was too late. Viktor clenched his fists, his mind swirling with emotions. He had always known Katya to be brilliant, a visionary in her field, but this was madness. She had toyed with forces she didn't fully comprehend, and now everyone was paying the price. We need to stop it, Viktor said, his voice hard. Whatever you've done, we need to find a way to undo it. We can't let this thing consume everything. Katya nodded, though her expression remained grim. There's only one way. The ritual, it can be reversed, but it requires a sacrifice. A life for a life. That's how it works. It's the only way to break the cycle. Viktor's blood ran cold. What kind of sacrifice? Katya met his gaze, her eyes filled with sorrow. Me, Viktor. I have to die. Her words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Viktor felt his heart drop. After everything, after all the horrors he had faced to find her, this was the answer? A sacrifice? The idea seemed impossible, cruel, and yet there was something in her eyes that told him she had known this all along. She had been preparing for this moment, even as she fought to survive. There has to be another way, Viktor said, his voice tight with desperation. We can find another solution.
We just need more time.
There is no more time, Viktor. Katya's voice was steady now, resigned. The power is already spreading. You've seen it yourself, the dead are changing, becoming something else. If we don't stop it now, it will consume everything, and there will be nothing left but darkness. Viktor's hands trembled as he processed her words. He didn't want to believe it, but deep down he knew she was right. He had seen the signs, the evolving dead, the strange symbols, the way the very air seemed to pulse with malevolence. This was no ordinary outbreak. This was something ancient, something that could not be contained. But you, Viktor's voice broke. You can't just die. There has to be another way. Katya shook her head sadly. There isn't. And you know that as well as I do. Viktor felt a lump rise in his throat as he stared at her, the weight of the decision pressing down on him like a vice. He had come here to save her, but now he was faced with an impossible choice: let her sacrifice herself to stop the spread of the darkness, or risk everything by trying to find another way. The room seemed to close in around them, the glowing symbols pulsing more intensely, as if they were waiting for a decision. Viktor felt the shadows pressing in, the unseen forces watching, waiting. Katya reached out and took his hand, her touch cold but comforting. I'm sorry, Viktor, she whispered, but this is the only way. Tears stung Viktor's eyes as he gripped her hand tightly. He didn't want to let go. He didn't want to lose her. But the world was crumbling around them, and the darkness was growing stronger with every passing second. With a heavy heart, Viktor nodded. Katya smiled faintly, a bittersweet expression. Thank you, she said softly. She stepped toward the center of the room, where the symbols on the floor glowed brightest. Viktor watched, his heart aching, as she knelt down, her hands trembling as she prepared to complete the ritual. The air around them seemed to hum with energy, and Viktor felt the darkness stirring, sensing the impending sacrifice. As Katya whispered the final words of the incantation, the room erupted in a blinding light. The symbols flared with a brilliant green glow, and Viktor shielded his eyes from the intensity. The air crackled with energy, and the ground beneath them shook violently. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the light faded, and the room fell silent. Viktor slowly lowered his hands, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. The symbols were gone, their glow extinguished. The oppressive feeling that had hung in the air was gone, replaced by an eerie calm. But Katya was gone, too. Viktor sank to his knees, his heart heavy with grief. The ritual had worked, the darkness had been stopped, but at a terrible cost. He had lost her. The silence of the room was deafening, and Viktor felt an overwhelming sense of emptiness wash over him. The world outside might have been saved, but his world had been shattered. As he sat there in the darkness, Viktor knew that he would never forget the sacrifice Katya had made. She had given her life to stop the darkness, to save everyone. But the price of that victory would haunt him forever. And somewhere, in the deepest corners of the town, the shadows watched silently, waiting for the next time the darkness would stir. Shadows of the past. Viktor remained kneeling on the cold floor, his heart weighed down by the crushing emptiness left in the wake of Katya's sacrifice. The air, now still and silent, felt like a mockery of the chaos that had just occurred. The once pulsing symbols on the walls were now dull and lifeless, but their presence lingered in his mind, a constant reminder of the forces that had toyed with them. He closed his eyes, the memory of Katya's final words echoing in his thoughts. This is the only way. Viktor wanted to scream, to rage against the world that had taken her from him, but no sound escaped his throat. His grief felt like a weight on his chest, squeezing the air from his lungs. For a long moment, he allowed himself to sit in that dark place, unable to find the strength to stand. The thought of facing the world without Katya, without her laughter, her brilliance, her fire seemed unbearable. And yet, as the silence pressed in on him, something stirred deep within the corners of his mind. A feeling that something wasn't right. He opened his eyes slowly, scanning the room. It was too quiet, too still. The oppressive weight of the darkness that had been consuming the town should have lifted, but Viktor couldn't shake the sense that something lingered. Something that hadn't been banished. He stood up, gripping his rifle tightly as he took a cautious step forward. His ears strained to catch any sound, but there was only the faint hum of the night beyond the broken windows. The school was a hollow shell now, devoid of life. Or so it seemed. Viktor's gut told him otherwise. He moved through the room, stepping carefully as if the floor itself might crumble beneath his feet. Every shadow seemed darker, every corner more menacing. The feeling of being watched had not left him. If anything, it had intensified. He felt the weight of unseen eyes following his every move. His mind raced. Had the ritual failed? Or worse, had it only delayed the inevitable? The thought gnawed at him, a growing sense of dread settling into his bones. Katya had said the darkness wanted her, but what if it wanted more than just her? What if, even now, it was reaching out, waiting for the next moment of weakness? Viktor paused at the door, casting one last glance over his shoulder at the room where Katya had performed the ritual. It was a tomb, now a place of sacrifice. He felt a pang of sorrow and guilt wash over him again. He hadn't been able to save her, and now, he wasn't sure if her death had even been enough. Steeling himself, Viktor stepped out into the hallway, his boots echoing loudly in the emptiness. The long corridor stretched before him, filled with broken lockers and shattered glass, the debris of a world that had been falling apart long before the dead had risen. He could feel the weight of the town's history bearing down on him, its forgotten secrets, its cursed past. As he walked, something flickered at the edge of his vision, a shadow, darting just beyond the reach of his flashlight. Viktor stopped, his body tensing. He swung the light toward the movement, but there was nothing there. Just empty darkness. His pulse quickened, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. The sense of being followed grew stronger. He wasn't alone. Something or someone was stalking him. "Who's there?" Viktor called out, his voice echoing down the hallway. But no answer came, only the suffocating silence. He took a few more steps, his heart pounding in his chest. The sensation of eyes watching him intensified, prickling at his skin. It was as though the shadows themselves were alive, moving just beyond his sight, taunting him with their presence. Then a voice, low, distant, and familiar.
Viktor.
He froze, his blood turning to ice. It was Katya's voice.
Viktor, come back.
The voice echoed from the darkness ahead, faint but unmistakable. It sounded distant, yet close enough to make him feel like she was standing just a few feet away. No, Viktor whispered under his breath, his heart hammering. This wasn't real.
Katya was gone.
She couldn't be calling to him now. But the voice persisted, soft and pleading. Viktor, I need you. Come back to me.
Viktor és mind részt.
Was this some kind of trick? A hallucination? Or had the darkness found a new way to torment him? His hands tightened around his rifle, but he felt no safer. The room seemed to warp around him, the air growing colder by the second. Viktor, please. The voice was closer now, almost behind him. He spun around, his flashlight cutting through the shadows. Nothing. Just empty space. But the feeling of being watched didn't disappear. It pressed in on him, thick and suffocating. This isn't real, he muttered to himself, trying to shake off the dread that was clawing at his mind. But the voice wouldn't stop. It was relentless, growing louder, more insistent.
Viktor.
The shout made him jump, his heart lurching into his throat. This time, the voice wasn't pleading. It was commanding, demanding, and it was coming from the very room where Katya had died. Against his better judgment, Viktor turned and started walking back toward the door. Every step felt heavier than the last, like something was pulling him, drawing him back into the place where the darkness had taken root. The sense of foreboding grew stronger with every breath. He reached the door and hesitated, his hand hovering over the handle. The faint green glow had returned, seeping through the cracks of the door. His pulse quickened. The ritual had ended. This should not be happening. With a trembling hand, Viktor pushed the door open. The room was bathed in the eerie green light once more, the symbols glowing on the walls, brighter than before. But that wasn't what made Viktor's blood run cold. Standing in the center of the room was Katya. Her back was to him, just as it had been before the ritual. But something was different. Her posture was rigid, unnatural, and the air around her seemed to crackle with dark energy. Katya? Viktor's voice wavered as he stepped inside, his heart thudding in his chest. Slowly, she turned to face him. But it wasn't the Katya he remembered. Her eyes, once filled with life, were now glowing with an unnatural green light. Her skin had taken on a pallid, almost translucent hue, and the symbols that had been etched into the walls were now carved into her flesh. She looked at Viktor with a cold, emotionless gaze, her mouth curling into a faint, eerie smile. "I told you," she whispered, her voice no longer her own. It was deeper, darker, filled with the malice of the ancient power that had consumed her. "You shouldn't have come." Viktor's body went numb as he stared at the thing that had once been Katya. The ritual hadn't saved her, it had taken her, transformed her into something monstrous. And now, the darkness had a new vessel. "Now you'll join me, Viktor." Her voice slithered through the air, wrapping around him like a vice. "We'll be together forever."